And Weber, I mean, Weber talked about everything really, but the city he wrote, he did have this. He did write about the cities and this distinction between city, urban life and rural life. It's a big contrast, isn't it? And it's quite important to the work that you've done and what you look at, and about trying to understand modernity. Um, so is the city something that for Weber and for yourself very, very important in the development of modernity and this kind of ability to think for yourself?
Yes, it is. I keep asking myself, why is Richard asking me such good questions? And I realize that they're on the list I sent him.
Yeah. I've got the list. I've got everything here.
You've internalized them so well, Richard.
Yeah,
and they
I
come.
go away and read this stuff, and then I come back. You see, so flooded with the Macfarlane thoughts.
Anyway, it's a question I'm keen to answer. I gave a series of lectures on the city, and I hadn't thought quite so much about it before. I mean, another reason why Weber is such a master is that his book on the city is, if you had sort of 3 books on the city that you had to read, his book on the city is one of the 3. It's a wonderful city because what he does is he takes the method I've mentioned, the ideal type method, and he said, well, what is a city? And then he gives about 5 constituents. Like it's a marketplace, it's a seat of political power, it's a separate legal system, it's a source of identity, and something else. It has a wall or whatever. He says that's an ideal type model city, as we conceive of it in the West now. If you said, what is New York or London? It's got all those sorts of things, maybe not the wall, but the other things. Then he takes that ideal type and he takes it across the world in his mind. He said, yes, we have those cities, and we've had them in Northwest Europe and America for the last few hundred years, a full city with all 5 characteristics. When you get to Southern Europe, you have 2 or 3 of them. They're not legally independent. As the famous German saying, city walls make you free. If you entered a North European city, you were a free person within the laws of that city. You don't have that in Florence or Venice or something. They are subsumed into larger political and legal entities, and they're not bounded in that way. And then when you go further east, if you looked at Islamic cities, they are marketplaces, very important marketplaces. But they're not much more. They're not legally bounded. They're not politically bounded. They often don't even have walls around them. They're just big market areas, really. The souk and the grand bazaar is what they are. And then if you go to India and you go extremely to China, a Chinese city, as he looked at it and as it was for hundreds of years, only had about 1 or 2 of those characteristics. It was often a market, an important market, where peasants bought their produce, but it was, as Skinner and others pointed out, only the top level market. You then had towns with markets, and then you had villages. And Skinner showed in his famous article that it's a planetary system. Every big market had sub-market. So it was the top market, so you can't really distinguish it from the rest of Chinese civilization by its market. It was often a political and military center. It was where the emperor kept his troops, and the mandarins might live there. That's basically what it was. And it had a very strong wall to protect those people and inside it. But it didn't have a local government, really. No guild system and no town fathers, who very weak in those respects, because it would have provoked the emperor, as it did frequently. If a city got too uppish and started putting down its own rules and so on, the emperor would come and destroy it, which happened again and again. So basically, it was just a walled enclosure for a market and keeping the troops. So there was nothing separate, because in American sociology, people like Gans and Girth and others had developed a very interesting idea of urbanism as a way of life. And they said that true cities of the kind that you got in Chicago or London were not just an area, they had a special spirit about them. And that was that people treated each other in a different way. You were not only free, but everything. For example, they looked at concepts of time. In the countryside, time is circular and the seasons, and it's agricultural time. In the city, it's clock time. And so city life is always hectic. City life is filled with strangers. In the countryside, you know the people you meet and so on. So the whole atmosphere within urbanism as a way of life is different from the countryside. And Raymond Williams, who wrote a famous book about the country and the city, talks about this. So Western cities are really special. Northwestern cities are different from, so Europe is divided into true modern cities and then the kind of cities we go and spend our summer holidays in Florence and so on, which are beautiful, but only partially like that. Now that was something that I really learned from Weber. But then I learned, and it partly comes from Marx as well. Marx said that one of the peculiarities of the English social development was that it was a civilization founded on the countryside. He said if you looked at the Anglo-Saxons and Tacitus and so on, you found that the roots of British civilization is the countryside. And so the continental view, which is cities and civilization, same root in Latin, civis, they are the same. Civilization is within the city. The elite live there, they talk in a special language, education is there. So the civilization is ruled from the cities, from Paris. Paris is everything. And I'll give you an anecdote which I may not have mentioned when one of my former students and a journalist came to visit me in this rural village in the Fens and looked around him. He said, "Alan, what are you doing living here, this pigsty out in the countryside?" I mean, no French intellectual would ever be seen dead in a country dwelling, except in their summer holidays, of course. But, you know, live in the high-rise flat in the middle of Paris, and then you are civilized. But Marx noticed, and this is something which I don't think Raymond Williams really completely understood, but quite a lot of people have, that the peculiarity of English civilization is that always the country has been where our hearts are. The dream, the middle class dream, was the country cottage with the honeysuckle growing outside. The powerful people were the county magistrates, the squires, the Jane Austen world. If you look at Jane Austen's world, it's not set in London. They go to London, of course, for the season, and it's where Parliament and so on. But it's in Bath and Cheltenham, and if you look at the distribution of religious power, it's not in London. It's in York and Canterbury and Cambridge and Oxford. Education. So the power is rural. Our poetry is rural. So basically we have a very rural, peculiar kind of relationship between urbanism, which distinguishes it. The moment you get, even into Holland, I mean, it's one of the shocks I got when I first used to go to the Dutch, that, you know, Antwerp and Amsterdam is where the action is, you know. And when we used to go for early holidays in France, you know, you moved very quickly from this Paris, which was everything, you know, all culture was there, and you went and you were immediately in this sort of 19th century world. And this affects everything. I mean, so basically you can argue, as I often do, you can argue that England is the least urbanized civilization because it's rural. Or you can argue that it's the most urbanized, that basically, because there's no division, the city spreads everywhere. So it was said of Norwich, for example, that it was a garden set in a city or a city set in a garden. It was difficult to tell because it was full of trees and parks. The love of the British for parks and trees and so on. We turn our cities as much as we can, and it's a distinctive feature which other countries have said, you know, why is our English city so full of green?
That's the